Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our YouTube series, The Perils Facing the African Continent, where we dig deep into Africa's history, politics, identity, and the forces that continue to shape our collective destiny. In the last episode, we unpacked the harsh realities of colonialism, a system that uprooted African governance, fractured cultures, and commodified people for imperial gain. You recall, colonialism did not just end because of time or goodwill, but it ended because Africans fought back intellectually, spiritually, and physically. In today's episode, titled Unchained, The African Struggle for Independence, we explore the untold courage and complexity of the liberation journey, a movement that was as much about reclaiming dignity as it was about reclaiming land. In this discussion, you will realize that the struggle for independence in Africa was a monumental historical movement marked by courage, sacrifice, and unwavering desire for self-determination. As we enjoy the fruits of independence today, it is important to acknowledge that the path that led to it was anything but easy. Each African state walked a unique road to freedom, but the continent as a whole shared a collective longing to break the chains of colonial oppression. In our earlier episode, we highlighted that colonization, which was formalized at the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885, was more than territorial conquest. It was a cultural and psychological invasion. Europeans justified their actions with paternalistic ideologies such as the civilizing mission, masking the brutality of conquest with the claims of enlightenment and Christianity. The decades of colonization were marked by violence, forced labor, land alienation, destruction of African economies, and attempts to dismantle cultural institutions. Yet from the beginning, Africans resisted. Even in the face of overwhelming force, African resistance emerged early and boldly. From west to east, north to south, local communities mounted both armed and spiritual revolt. In southern Africa, the first Chimurenga uprising, 1896 to 1897, saw the Shona and Ndebele revolt against the British South African Company rule, grounded in African spiritual beliefs and a rejection of land seizures and labor exploitation. The Maji Maji Rebellion, this was 1905 to 1907, in German East Africa, was one of the earliest and most significant pan-ethnic revolts. Sparked by German coercion to grow cotton, over 20 ethnic groups united under spiritual leadership that promised immunity from the bullet through Maji, or magic water. The Germans responded with extreme brutality, destroying villages, crops, and water sources. An estimated 300,000 Africans died, many through starvation. Despite its failure, the Maji Maji Rebellion revealed the potential for unity across tribal lines and marked a major psychological turning point in anti-colonial resistance. In Kenya, Koitalel Arap Samoei resisted British railway expansion and land seizure in the early 1900s. His assassination in 1905, under the guise of peace talks, symbolized the ruthless nature of colonial authorities. Soon after, along the Kenyan coast, Mekatilili Wamenza, a Griama spiritual leader, galvanized her people against British rule using traditional oaths and rituals, especially opposing the forced labor and taxation system. In Ethiopia, unlike most of Africa, Emperor Menelik II successfully resisted Italian invasion at the Battle of Adowa in 1896. As a result, Ethiopia remained the only African nation, aside from Liberia, to retain its sovereignty during the colonial era. As resistance grew, African intellectuals, particularly those in the diaspora, began articulating a broader vision for unity and freedom. The Pan-African movement emerged at the turn of the 20th century, driven by African, Caribbean, and African-American thinkers who saw Africa's oppression as part of a global pattern of racial injustice. Through this effort, the first Pan-African Conference was held in London in 1900, organized by Henry Sylvester Williams and attended by figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois, laying the ideological foundation for global Black solidarity. Over the following few decades, the Pan-African Congress continued to press for the rights of Africans in colonies and for self-determination. However, it was the Fifth Pan-African Congress held in Manchester in 1945 that catalyzed the colonization era. Attended by key future leaders such as Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, George Padmore, and Ami Garvey, the Congress called for an end to colonialism and economic exploitation. Their manifesto boldly stated, and I quote, "We are determined to be free. We want education. We want the right to earn a decent living, the right to express ourselves or our thoughts and emotions, to adapt and create forms of beauty. We will fight in every way we can for freedom, democracy, and social betterment." I end quote. Following the end of the World War II, that was 1945, the pace of decolonization accelerated and was a pivotal moment for African liberation. The war had weakened European powers economically and politically. Britain and France, in particular, lacked the resources to maintain their vast empires. Additionally, over 1 million African soldiers who had fought in European armies returned home politically awakened to build political movements that could challenge colonial rule directly. They questioned the contradiction of dying for freedom in Europe while living under oppression at home. African intellectuals and activists, ex-servicemen, trade unionists, and students became leading voices in the post-war nationalist movements. The late 1940s and 1950s also witnessed the emergence of structured nationalist movements across the continent. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah formed the Convention People's Party, CPP, and launched positive action campaigns. In Kenya, as early as 1944, Jomo Kenyatta led the Kenya African Union, advocating for land restitution and political rights. Parallel to this, the underground Mau Mau movement launched a guerrilla war between 1952 and 1960, demanding land reforms and freedoms in Kenya. While in Nigeria, the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons under Nnamdi Azikiwe demanded constitutional change. In French colonies, movements under Félix Boigny pushed for autonomy through political engagement. These groups organized boycotts, protests, and later fully fledged revolts. They formed alliances with the League Against Imperialism, built bridges with global solidarity movements, and participated in international forums to denounce colonialism. The independence struggles bore iconic leaders whose vision went beyond national sovereignty. Kwame Nkrumah called for a United States of Africa. Julius Nyerere promoted Ujamaa, African socialism in Tanzania. Sekou Toure, Modibo Keita, and Ahmed Ben Bella, each, among others, contributed to the Pan-African ideology and liberation. Amid diverse experiences, African nations found common cause. Leaders like Kwame Nkrumah, Nyerere, and Haile Selassie championed Pan-Africanism, leading to the formation of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, in 1963, with headquarters in Addis Ababa. And the mission of the OAU was to support decolonization, promote unity, and defend sovereignty. Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt offered material support and ideological inspiration, bridging North African and Sub-Saharan liberation efforts. His stance during the Suez Crisis of 1956 against the British, French, and Israel strengthened Afro-Arab solidarity and showed that colonial resistance was achievable. The United Nations became a vital platform for African voices. New states used the General Assembly to raise awareness and pressure colonial powers. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 gave African activists a legal and moral framework to demand their rights. These instruments enabled African movements to globalize their cause, winning allies around the world. As a result of all these efforts, the 1960s marked a golden era for African decolonization. In the late 1950s and 60s alone, 17 African countries became independent, from Ghana in 1957 to Nigeria, Uganda, Kenya, Zambia, and Malawi, among many others. A wave of euphoria swept the continent. National anthems were sung, flags raised, and constitutions drafted. African voices began to take their rightful place on the world stage, in the United Nations, the non-aligned movement, and at the Organization of African Unity. Today, as African nations mark independence anniversaries with pride, it is critical that we remember this legacy. We must honor not only the leaders whose names are etched in history, but also the ordinary men and women, farmers, students, soldiers, mothers who resisted, fought, and envisioned a better tomorrow. As we reflect on this journey, let us commit to upholding the ideals for which independence was won: justice, equality, and unity. Because the struggle didn't end with independence, it merely changed the form. Finally, as you reflect on the current crisis facing the African continent, I urge you to deeply reflect on the residual, enduring, and cumulative effects of the destructive arrival of the Europeans about the 15th century on the African continent, the over 300 years of devastating slave trade, particularly the transatlantic slave trade, and the almost a century of colonial rule. I argue that the negative combined effects of these disasters, which the continent faced, continue to reverberate across Africa, undermining its path for growth, peace, and stability. In our next episode, we dive into the Cold War and Africa, where we look at ideology, aid, and interference. We'll explore how African states were thrust into the middle of global rivalry between the West and the East, how this shaped leadership, coups, foreign policy, and even freedom itself across the continent. Stay tuned. The struggle for true liberation is still being written. Thank you.